My day ones will know that I made a video on this very such topic once before, and if you don't, then your loyalty is now in question. Anyhow, I rewatched the video and I found that it was quite messy, boring, and I really didn't hammer the point as much as I ought to have. But this time things are going to be different. I'm going to make the argument, or rather attempt, I guess, that the concept of hell does indeed exist, but it's not a place for human souls. And in order to demonstrate this point, I'm going to use the original languages of the Bible, Hebrew and Koine Greek, specifically that it was a mistranslation or misinterpretation of long ago. So all throughout the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament to many Christians, there is a singular word for the afterlife. That is Sheol. And it's unclear whether this means, if it's like a state of death or if it was like a physical place to the ancient Hebrews. But this isn't the video for that necessarily. But what needs to be stressed here, and I horribly failed to stress this last time, is that there is no concept of hell in Judaism, at least not the Christian version of it. We'll come back to this thought, so hold that for me. So when the Greeks translated the Hebrew Bible, they typically used the word Hades in place of Sheol. And to the English ear, we're accustomed to hearing Hades, not Hades, through popular media. Now, there are loads of theories as to what this word could represent to the ancient peoples of the Near East. Hades wasn't also just a place, it was a deity, of course. And this puts a kink in things, as one might imagine. So, what if Paul was using the word as a double meaning to try to entice the Greek-speaking peoples of the area to rally to the new, fresh movement? It's just a thought. My personal take, and I know no one really asked for that, is that, using the word that the context that the word's usually employed in, I think that it embodies the state of death. That is, the eternal state of unconsciousness. Let's play with an example. My favorite pastime, as a matter of fact. Let's use Acts chapter 2, verse 30. So Peter is, he's preaching to the crowd about how the resurrection of the Messiah was prophesied back in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. I think it was Psalms chapter 16:10. And it says something like, "You will not abandon me to Sheol." And note that preposition here. It doesn't say you will not abandon me, God will not abandon the Messiah in Sheol. It says to Sheol. It says the same thing in Acts chapter 2, verse 30 in the Greek. Peter is proclaiming that the prophecy was basically fulfilled, and the Greek translates as, and I have it right here, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his body see decay. It makes more sense to me that, using this context, God was basically saying that he will not allow death to conquer the Messiah. It would make less sense to me that God was saying that he will not leave the Messiah in hell, which is what the Catholic Church believe today. I think it's something called the descent of Jesus into hell, or something of that wordplay. But if you also consider other parts of the New Testament, let's take Revelation 20:14 per se, which says that death and Hades will be thrown into the lake of fire. So, Hades, how is it going to be equivalent to the concept of hell if it itself is thrown into hell? So to me, Hades is something closer to the Jewish perception of the afterlife, and that is just, eternal consciousness until the day of judgment. All right, let's take a few steps back. I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So Hades is the word that the Greeks used for Sheol when they translated the Hebrew Bible. But in fact, there was another word over in the New Testament that the Greeks used to represent this concept as well. That word is Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is certainly the most mentioned term that's translated into hell in the New Testament. It's a transliteration of the Hebrew word Gehenna, which means the Valley of Hinnom. And this place actually physically existed in ancient times. Long before the time of Jesus, it was delegated as a place where the Canaanites would sacrifice children to the god Molech. So, you can imagine to the Jews, this place was quite unholy and sacrilegious to the core. And by the 1st century AD, it was actually delegated as a dumping ground for bodies that were unwanted or unclaimed to be disposed of. And then to prevent disease, and I assume as some sort of cleansing ritual, it was also fires were lit to burn these bodies throughout the valley day and night. All of these things considered, it was a place of religious defamation, I would say. And it's difficult to understand the level of insult it would be to have your body hurled into this valley, post-death. It's, like today we live in quite a secular society that stakes our reputation off of very non-religious attributes. These people lived to preserve not only their integrity, but their family's integrity, and as a means, they had to use religion to accomplish this. Proper burials were very sacred also to these people, and if your body was thrown into a fiery dump that was known as a place of child sacrifice long before them, like Gehenna, it would be a spit in the face to their spiritual devotion, so to speak. It's like this is what they stake their lives on, their livelihood. And I believe this is what's meant when the term is tossed around in the New Testament. And let's take Matthew chapter 23, verse 33. This is a good start. So Jesus is deeming the specific Jewish sect as, they're known as the Pharisees, as hypocritical and corrupt. And towards the end, he states, how will you escape being condemned to Gehenna? There's many more passages I can go into on depth. Gehenna is also a term placed where the worms that eat do not die and where the fires are not quenched. And there are also passages that speak of eternal punishment. See, this wordplay, this is why people automatically interpret the word as the way it's seen today, where your body burns for eternity. But we have to consider the historical context here, the specific terms, and especially what the Jews of the time period believed in. Just because fire is unquenchable does not mean your body's going to feel the sensation of burning for forever and ever. And the phrase eternal punishment is not a present participle verb, it's a noun. So you don't have to interpret this as an action ongoing forever. Punishment forever to the Jews meant something like permanent death to the soul and not being resurrected. You exit the game without the ability to return. That's it. Once you're out, you're out. And over the centuries, the Christian interpretation is that the polar opposite of everlasting life, it's become everlasting torturement. There's even multiple verses in the original Greek that confirms this Jewish perspective, in fact. Verses that Christians recite every day without a second thought, too. John 3:16, probably the most memorable verse in the New Testament. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. The twofold path is laid out right here. Shall not perish, shall not die, but have everlasting life, live on forever. Romans 6:23, another quite memorable verse, which states, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. All right, so you may be familiar with the terms lake of fire or lake of burning sulfur. This phrase strictly comes from the book of Revelation. It's not found outside of it, to the best of my knowledge. And it is specifically meant for the devil and his band of deceivers, not for human souls. Other verses in the New Testament seem to align with the standpoint too. Take Matthew chapter 25, verse 41, for example, which plainly asserts that it was prepared for these such beings. Okay, now that my blood pressure has spiked, let's take a step back, let's take a deep breath, and let's do a brief recap. So the Greek terms that have been translated into hell are Hades and Gehenna, or Hades and Gehenna. In this context, Hades is synonymous with the Jewish term Sheol, which is basically a communal grave where the dead remain until the resurrection or the day of judgment. Gehenna was a physical place, but it was more of a religious metaphor for a place where the unholy dwell, or the unholy bodies specifically dwell. But there is no suggestion of torturement in these passages related to this. Historically and presently, Jewish belief in eternal damnation for the human souls does not exist. You got to remember, Jesus, his disciples, and the authors of the New Testament were all Jewish. And to the best of my knowledge, they didn't belong to a sect of the faith where they believed in such a notion as the modern concept of hell. Lastly, eternal punishment for Jews is and was not being granted a resurrection. I think there's somewhere in the New Testament, I think it's the book of Matthew, where Jesus says that God is not a God of the dead, but a God of the living. So you would perish, you would cease to exist for all ages, while the righteous lived on. I'm not trying to pin the blame on anyone, I'm really not. But it doesn't help when all these terms were conflated into one term in the KJV translation, hell. It's allowed room for misconceptions to form, I'd say, which is unfortunate. But personally, it would make more sense for a place like hell to not exist, from a logical standpoint, in my opinion. It's stated abundantly all throughout the New Testament that God, both the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, that God is a merciful being. So, it fits in my mind. Well, I hope I made my argument. somewhat understandable, cohesive, coherent. And I hope I did better than last time. And I hope you learned a thing or two about a thing or two. And until next time.